on Friday. All that brings us to Maryland's Democratic Congressman Chris Van Hollen. He's the ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee. He's also an Obama campaign surrogate. Nice to see you, as always. Thanks for talking with us this morning. We certainly appreciate it.
Soledad, good to be with you.
Thank you very much. We know the Democrats had passed, the tax cuts passed in the Senate last week. What do you think is the likelihood that, in fact, in the House, a similar thing will happen?
Well, we would like it if our House Republican colleagues would take up the president's plan, the plan that passed the Senate last week, which would provide tax relief really to 100% of the American people compared to what the current law provides. It provides total tax relief to 98% of the American people. The top 2% don't get quite as much, but Republicans in the House have said that they're going to prevent that tax relief for 98% from going forward unless they get this bonus tax break for folks at the top. I hope they'll reconsider. We're going to put forward a proposal, the Democrats, that's identical to the Senate proposal, which means that if our House Republican colleagues agreed to it, it would go directly to the White House. The president could sign it next week.
And very unlikely,
really so easy.
Right? I mean, very unlikely that your House Republican colleagues are going to agree to it.
That's right, but I think it is important to understand what they're saying. They're saying that even though they say they want to provide this tax relief to 98% of the American people, they will only allow that to go forward if you provide this extra bonus tax cuts for folks at the very top, which increase the long-term deficit at everybody else's expense.
Well, they're saying tax cuts for all, and it sounds like Democrats are saying, well, tax cuts up to $250,000 if you're talking about a family, and $200,000 if you're talking about an individual. So as the fiscal cliff approaches us, and every day I say that, I get more and more anxious about it, is it better to extend, given the option, better to extend the tax cuts for all, or is it better to just let them all expire if you were given those two options?
Right. Well, first of all, just a clarification. So people who are making over $250,000 under the Democratic proposal get tax relief on the first $250,000, the same tax relief that everybody else gets on that income. Number one, the reason it's important not to continue with this trickle-down theory that we inherited from the Bush years is it's blowing a big hole in our long-term deficit. And if we don't ask folks at the very high end to pay a little bit more to contribute to the deficit, it means everybody else gets whacked that much harder. It means seniors on Medicare have to end up paying more. It means we cut our kids' education and investments in important infrastructure and other areas that are important to the economy, which is why every bipartisan group that's looked at our deficit challenge has recommended a balanced approach. Cuts, and we did about $1 trillion in cuts over 10 years as part of the Budget Control Act. We should do more over time. But they also recommended that we deal with the revenue side of the equation, because if you don't ask folks at the very high end to pitch in more, as I say, everybody else gets hit. It comes at other people's expense.
So, Congressman Van Hollen, hold it right there for 1 second while I talk to Margaret Hoover for a moment, because he's sort of stating what the Republican position is about the balanced approach. Of course, the position doesn't spell out how you get to that growing revenue, clearly.
Right, and it also doesn't spell out how you change, how you make reforms. Because as we all know, on the spending side, reforms have to be made on Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid in order for these programs to be sustainable for people my and younger into the future. So a balanced approach where everybody's happy to have and talk about it, if it's an honest balanced approach, not kabuki Congress, things that are passed before November that are simply for show.
So let's go back to the congressman for a moment. You mentioned the Budget Control Act, and you voted in favor of it, but you said this: the cuts, $1.2 trillion over 10 years, are reckless and irresponsible way to reduce the deficit. It was designed to be so unpalatable that the Democrats and Republicans would come together to avoid this sort of Damocles? Sorry.
The sword of Damocles, yes.
Thank you. My Greek tragedies are not that strong in that.
Greek mythology.
I'm much better with English literature. That was what my degree was in. You wrote that op-ed in Politico back on July 18th. You voted for that. I mean, ultimately, isn't your vote and that of your colleagues what brought us to where we are today, which is dealing with the massive cuts in military spending that everybody's saying are potentially a disaster?
Well, Soledad, I did vote for that because I believe we do have to reduce our long-term deficit. And what we did in the Budget Control Act was two things. One, we immediately put spending caps for 10 years on discretionary spending. That's $1 trillion in savings. but we also understood we needed to get another about $1 trillion at least in savings, and there was no agreement on how to get there because our Republican colleagues refused to take the balanced approach that's been recommended by bipartisan groups, which involves not just cuts, but also asking folks at the very top to contribute more to deficit reduction, beginning to close some of these big loopholes like the big taxpayer giveaways to the big oil companies. They refuse to take that kind of approach, which is why we're right here. We put forward, the Democrats in the House put forward a proposal to prevent the sequester from taking place by replacing it with a combination of cuts to, for example, farm subsidies that are unnecessary right now, and secondly, eliminating a lot of the tax breaks for big oil companies. That would have prevented the sequester, at least in the first year, by replacing it with a much smarter approach to deficit reduction. But again, because it had some revenue, in this case generated from closing tax breaks for big oil companies, Republicans said no to that. If I could quickly address the health care issue, which is very clearly something we have to address in the long term. And what we've put forward is a change in Medicare that would move us away from a strict fee-for-service system, which does drive up use and costs, and replace it with a system that rewards physicians and providers based on the quality of care they provide, not the quantity of care. And in that way, we can begin to bring down costs. We do reject the Republican approach, which is to simply shift costs onto seniors. We don't think that that is the right way to do it, especially since the median income of a senior on Medicare is under $23,000.
As you describe it, it sounds like both sides are very far apart. You're going to take your recess for 5 weeks in 2 more days, today, and then you've got tomorrow and Friday, and you're gone for 5 weeks. Then overall, before the end of the year, you don't really have very much time to try to get this all worked out. Congressman Chris Van Hollen joining us this morning. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you. I would just say the bipartisan groups provide a model. I wish we would all start looking at those.
And Margaret is nodding her head, so maybe there we have